begin our morning keynote, and it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Housley. Now, if you folks think your jobs are challenging, let me tell you what Adam Housley does for a living. Adam joined Fox News Channel in 2001 as a Los Angeles-based correspondent. He covered the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. He reported during the Chilean mine rescue and from Haiti after the deadly earthquake. Adam reported from Nicaragua and El Salvador on the war against drugs. He also reported during Operation Iraqi Freedom from Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, and the Persian Gulf, and has covered the war on terror from Pakistan, Israel, the West Bank. Now, those are just a few of the highlights of his career. And yet, on top of that, Adam is covering CES for Fox News. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Housley.
CES, as you guys all know, is a love-hate thing. You can tell by my voice that CES can do things to your voice after a couple of days, so I apologize for being a little bit raspy this morning. I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, who was at the FCC, surprisingly before iPhones. I'm not sure if any of us can remember that time, but there was a time before iPhones. Michael Powell was a former chairman, of course, of the FCC from 2001 through 2005, and was a member of the FCC for about 8 years. Nominated back during President Clinton's when President Clinton was in the White House, of course, and sworn in back in 1997. He was designated, though, by President George W. Bush as chairman back in 2001 and served through April 2005. Michael's most recent role, of course, began as a tenure the president and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association just last April. And while at the FCC, we should note that he set out to bring out regulations, to bring the 21st century regulations up to par. As we all know, the changes that really came through from the late 90s up even until today, everything from video phones that we saw in the field, of course, to the chance any one of us can carry around a small computer in our hand, to BlackBerries, which I'm using even as part of this introduction. He's an Army veteran. Served at the DOJ, undergrad at William & Mary, and graduated with his JD from Georgetown. And I'm sure if you asked him, it's probably his most proud designation would be husband and father of two. Our keynote speaker for this morning is Michael Powell.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate that. And good morning to everyone. I cannot tell you how honored I am to be here, because not only do I share a personal passion for the subject that we're all engaged in, I really do believe we are looking at how to reconstruct the American dream in the information age. And somewhere that answer lies in the combination of the advanced technology that's been brought forth by an extraordinary technological revolution, which I want to talk a little bit about, and its combination with the critical importance of education and a knowledge economy. I am really privileged to lead an industry that's long necessarily had a commitment to education. I say necessarily because I don't think industry groups generally act out of charity. I think they generally act out of their self-interest. But if you're an industry committed to the information age, either through the construction of broadband and information infrastructure, you are dependent not only on an educated consumer base that can make use of that architecture, but a labor force in the future that will be capable of continuing to drive returns. But we're passionate about children, we're passionate about education, and through initiatives like our foundation, Cable in the Classroom, that's long been committed to providing resources to schools, and a new initiative we announced recently in which we are offering broadband at very low cost to kids and families on school lunch programs nationwide throughout the United States as our commitment both to our country, our industry, and the future of our children. I also have a personal interest. I love higher education. I, went to school. I guess that's where it starts. I served as the rector of the College of William & Mary for many years. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School, and I'm chair of America's Promise, Grad Nation Dropout Campaign, in which we're trying desperately to eradicate the epidemic in America of high school dropout crisis. So this is a subject of personal passion. And I have the benefit of having come from a generation of educators on my mother's side, starting with the Bell family. And you know, I had a great-great-grandmother, and her name was Algetha Bell, and she was born in 1870. When I think about that from a technological progress standpoint, she would have been born in an era where she would have been reading by oil, walking or traveling by foot or horse carriage. But by the time in 1879, she would have perhaps seen the witness of the invention of the light bulb, the electric light bulb by Thomas Edison. By her 15th birthday, Henry Ford would have manufactured the first automobiles, and a few years later, the Wright brothers would have ushered in the era of powered flight. In the 1920s, she would have observed the invention of plastics, and the mass production of steel would have begun to create skyscrapers and the skylines that we've come to associate with the great American cities. And in every one of those apartments now would be wired with electricity and a whole rash of domestic appliances. The country would begin to be crisscrossed by asphalt highways and an interstate system that will allow those automobiles invented in her life to traverse the country. And by 1952, she would have been able to visit her children and grandchildren by commercial flight. And by 1959, the year my great-great-grandmother died, the Soviet space probe Lunik 2 would have reached the moon. That's from horse-drawn carriage to space flight in one generation. And that's the pace of the industrial age. Pales in comparison to the exponential speed that we're witnessing of growth in the information age, the one that my children and the students we hope to change have grown up with. You know, when I was at the FCC, we talked about the chairman before iPhone. That sounds really a long time ago. 2 days ago, the iPhone celebrated its 5th year, invented 5 years earlier, so it doesn't make me that dated. But I remember sitting at my seat on the last day in office in the government, and I thought back on my 8 years and was astonished the way that I could mark my tenure by the virtue of technology. In the time that I had been there, when I went to the FCC in the late 90s, nobody I knew had a cell phone. By the time I left, everyone I knew did. I watched DVRs take place, cell phones, high-definition television, Blackberries, MP3 players, the internet itself and Wi-Fi be invented. And oh yes, the Xbox 360. A gaming system that is 20,000 times more powerful than the lunar landing module. And it's a child's play toy for less than $200. That's what's astonishing about the toys and the environment that our children are now growing up with. Our children are strange. They're unusual. I don't know about yours, but mine certainly are. They are the first generation that's grown up purely digital. My children have never put their finger in the dial of a rotary phone. They've never known a world without a remote control. They've never seen the Star-Spangled Banner sign off on television at midnight. They've never seen a vinyl record or record player in their entire life. They are Homo digitalis, an entirely unusual species which we can only hope to understand. My youngest son, I remember, really brought this home to me one day in Virginia when the power went out due to a hurricane. Have you all seen Homo digitalis without power? This is a frightening and frustrated creature that begins bouncing aimlessly around the house, trying to understand what has suddenly happened to disrupt his world so powerfully. And I remember him walking into the bedroom of my wife and I and saying, "What's happening? Do you mean we can't watch TV?" "No, we can't watch TV. We can't play Xbox? We can't play Xbox. We can't get on the computer? Can't get on the computer." First of all, I'm very disturbed. He doesn't yet find the common denominator in this whole story. But bottom line, son, none of it works. And he skulks out of the room, quite distressed by this new development. And my wife and I, all of a sudden, are very excited. What does this mean? We're going to have quality time as a family. Someone please find the Monopoly board. We might have dinner together by candlelight. Maybe we'll have conversation. This could be a real opportunity. Hopefully the power will stay out for days, and at the end of it, we'll be a better, richer, more caring family. So I got up all excited, pulsed around the bedroom a little bit, and then I hear this noise in the kitchen downstairs, and I hear the digitae crumbling around, and I heard the door slam open, and a whole contingent of them marching out the front door. And I go to the window, and I look out, and there he is, marching across the yard through the driveway with 6 friends in tow, a bag of chips, a box of DVDs, climbing into the back of the minivan. Having suddenly found 12 volts of power, quite serendipitously, he's climbed in the back of Chrysler Stadium seating and proceeded to spend the next 5 or 6 hours watching movies. But I think one of the things that struck me was this is a child that expects to be informed, plugged in anytime and anywhere. It's also a kid who is intent on finding and creating his world when no one will provide it to him. That theme will return constantly. My older son, Jeff, is also someone I watch with interest. You know, for many years in high school, he had a girlfriend, I think. I never really met this young woman. I don't know that I really even know her name. I did know that her screen name was Clowns Give Me Nightmare 323. And apparently this was a relationship conducted entirely virtually as far as I could tell. But that's their world. And just the other day, I jumped in my car. I had my young niece and nephew. And I had the navigation of the car radio system turned off. And as I pulled out of the driveway, my young niece, Abby, starts screaming in panic. Uncle Michael, stop the car. I said, why? What's wrong? She goes, you don't have the GPS on. How will we know where we're going? So there you have it. They are different. They are the birth, the prodigy of a revolution, and I think the rest of us are frauds. Most of us are trying to adapt to a change that's taken place in our lifetime. But what we really have an obligation to do is make the world ready for the generation that's rising up below us. I love the story of the communication revolution, and sometimes it pays to go back to the basics to understand what we're dealing with. In reality, we are witnessing the confluence of 2 great technological trends. One we did grow up with and are quite familiar with, and that's the analog communications revolution. Ever since the early 1800s, when Maxwell developed the laws of electromagnetism and allowed us to begin to produce and create electronic systems that could propagate communication through the propulsion of electrons, we had the birth of the analog communications industry. Analog means analogous, meaning I could speak in this microphone and some facsimile of what I say, some analogy of what I say will come out the other end in the speakers of this room. And indeed, communication systems for the next 100 years would spend most of their sophisticated computing power and investment to make those systems of higher quality. The communications systems we grew up with were all about increasing fidelity. Right? There's a reason we called our stereos hi-fi. There's a reason Sprint would advertise you can hear a pin drop. There's a reason that can you hear me now? And the voices of analog communications were all about improving the high quality of this facsimile in the analog system. And communication was very bidirectional. It was just one-to-one, A to B. Telephone company might have been very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, it was nothing but tin cans and string, just at a much more sophisticated level. No change in content, receivers at either end. So that's an interesting revolution. It certainly changed our world as we know it, but I don't think the one we're talking about would be here without an additional ingredient. And I believe you could mark that in many ways, but that additional agreement arrived when Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce integrated transistors into silicon in the early 50s, and the microprocessing revolution was born. And from then on, you know the law given in the name of Gordon Moore, Moore's Law, began to produce the most powerful technology productivity curve in the history of mankind. Power of microprocessors began doubling every 2 years and dropping in cost at the same rate. And what we began to have is the increasing power of computers. When Gordon Moore first wrote his seminal article in which Moore's law is taken from, you could put 60 transistors into one slice of silicon. Today we put billions in the same space. And what that's come to mean is what I think is not only do we have enormous power, we have the ability to miniaturize communication and computing power to a level that interacts with our human senses. It's one thing to have a room filled with a big computer, but we've watched it march from that to something that sits on your desk, to something that sits on your lap, to something that sits in your palm, to something that can sit on your wrist, and then seamlessly begin to disappear into the architecture of our world. As we sit here in this room, this heating and air conditioning system has all kinds of sensors and microprocessors evaluating the room and our collective comfort. You buy a car today, it is filled with hundreds of minor computer processing devices, and when you open the hood, all you see is a big block being completely controlled by the sophistication of those systems. In healthcare, we begin to see microprocessors inserted into the bloodstream to measure glucose levels or to replace the retina of an eye or the lost sound of an eardrum. Our world will be revolutionized not only by the power but the miniaturization. But combine that with the advances in the storage of data. I remember I bought my first hard disk in the 80s. I was a Mac user, a Steve Jobs disciple, who famously did not want the early Macs to have a hard drive, so he had to go buy one. I remember buying it. Mine was called the Mac Bottom. It was 10 megabits. I still have the receipt. It was $1,082.73. Right now on my hip, I have 30 gigabytes that I paid less than $200 for. My children rock around essentially with cheap storage that can contain, as far as they're concerned, a relatively infinite amount of information. The idea that I can have a device on my hip that holds 60,000 pictures or hundreds of thousands of songs is breathtaking at the price. And then when you add software and the ability to control and interact all of those things, you have these three S's that bring us what I would call the smart tools and toys of the digital revolution, which are all on display downstairs. You put silicon software together and storage in one direction, and they're an iPod or a BlackBerry or a TiVo. You put them in another direction, they're a smart TV. There's nothing that fancy about just recombining these enormous and important components to create these incredibly fun, interesting, and informative and powerful tools and toys. And by the way, that's really the beginning of the democratization of technology. The idea that my little Homo digitei have a device 17 to 20,000 times more powerful than the lunar module is breathtaking. But I even think that's not enough. Its power comes when the neuron network is created and those devices become networked in an information architecture. And the firstborn child of that revolution is what we know as the internet today. And then with that combination of the smart tools and toys and the internet, you have the most powerful innovation platform in the history of the world. And from then on, we've been off to the races ever since. In a world in which everything that we are aware of has changed. Just understand a network, not to bore you with communication architecture, but forever a network was basically a hub and spoke, like a bicycle wheel. At the center of that wheel was some smart institution or some centralized set of computing devices, whether it be AT&T's switch or the US government's mainframes. You, the consumer, you, the people, had no ability to access, know about, control, develop, or innovate in any way the intelligence of that network. On the periphery of that bicycle wheel were just a bunch of dumb devices that were given to us. You grew up with a black or beige phone, the greatest innovation of which in my entire youth was the invention of the pink and blue princess phone that could actually hang on the wall, extraordinary long cable. But this thing rings when AT&T tells it to ring. It performs in the way that AT&T tells it to perform. You were nothing but a passive recipient on the edge of the network. We even coined phrases like couch potatoes. We are passive consumers of electronic equipment. The new network is a stupid network. It's completely inside out. there is no central intelligence. There is no company that owns the middle of the internet or the guts of the architecture. The devices, the network is commanded by the devices that we just talked about on the periphery. The most important aspect of that is we've gone from a world of a handful of funded innovators to billions. Billions. Imagine if the brain suddenly adds a billion neurons, the computing capacity that comes with that. And what we have seen is in that first wave of digital natives, people who now have at their disposal a distribution network, a delivery network, and tools powerful enough to change their world when they find it not to their liking. And that's what Sean Fanning did, age 18, who was tired of paying for bad Britney Spears albums coupled together by some music company. And he invented Napster and almost tore down the music industry single-handedly at the age of 18. And by the way, which has never recovered and has changed music forever. Or maybe you're Chad Hurley, just a kid playing around with your video camera, going to parties, taking videos of your friends, but you have no convenient way to share it. Nobody offers you this product. So you decide to make it yourself, and you invent YouTube. And you sell it 3 years later for $1.7 billion to Google. Or maybe you're Mark Zuckerberg, bored, sophomore at Harvard University, age 24, no, not at the time, 20, who decided that socializing in the traditional ancient ways was not to his liking. You know the rest of the story, some $100 billion of value later. Or Sergey, or Larry, or any one of the other young people who go out and make the world in their image. They are not tolerant of being dictated to in this space. The other thing that's changed radically is communication systems were always these analogs, but we invented the ability to digitize them. What does that mean? It means the whole of human communications has now been reduced to an alphabet of just 2 digits, 0 and 1. If I put zeros and ones in one order, they're a picture. I put them in another order, they're a video. I put them in another order, they're data. And more importantly, you now have translated communications into a language spoken by the machine. So now we can computer process. And what do I mean by that? Now I can speak in this microphone in English and have it come out French. Now I can speak in this microphone orally and have it converted to text and sent to a BlackBerry. You know these products. You have them on your apps. You download them every day. We can convert and redistribute communications in perfect replication. Remember, the challenge of the information age before was to get that quality. Now we have perfect reproduction, which is why Hollywood is panicked about the ability to reproduce or take a movie or redo Harry Potter in the basement of somebody's home. So this has really changed remarkably, and it erases distinctions we used to have between these spaces. Markets have changed too, not to spend a lot of time on it, but once upon a time there was something called a telephone company that used a twisted copper wire to provide a two-way voice service, and we called it Telecommunications, and it's regulated separately and specially, and there are a handful of companies we called the phone guys. Or they use coaxial cable to provide video services, and we called them the cable guys. Or broadcasting. They all now have networks that are convert to digitalization, use data and the internet, and they all provide everything. There is no difference of any meaning anymore. Those spaces erase. And the other thing that happens is, for Homo Digitalis, we've gone from mass market to mini market. What was the single phrase you would say marked the industrial age? I would say it was one size fits all. It was Henry Ford, you can have any car you want as long as it's black. The great industrial invention was the assembly line, continued and steady reproduction of the same thing. It was houses that had the same floor plan in Levitan. It was the man in the gray flannel suit. It was Karl Marx's anxiety that man had become a cog in a machine. It was mass media, one to many. We all sat around the television set at 6:30 and listened to Walter Cronkite at the same time. Now we have a world of mini markets, which is 180 degrees the other way. High degrees of customization, individualization. Make the world your own. That's the key to the kind of markets we see today. And then what happens to the consumer, and by the way, now that we get to education, the student. The first thing I know about them is they demand to participate in their interactions with technology. They will not be passive. One year when I was at the FCC, the Nielsen ratings came out, and television companies were panicked because little boys had disappeared. They were not showing up in the ratings. Part of that was they were playing gaming systems. So I was curious. I had 2 little boys. I went home and I said to them, why don't you guys watch more TV? Dad, why? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything. To them, communications is a verb, not a noun. They have to be an active participant. Watch them. They can't sit there without control of the remote control. They want to sit there and shoot at the TV or interact with the TV or be invited to have their opinion or their interest represented in it. They are more social. Today, HD kids rarely manage any part of their life in a way that they don't anticipate working out with teams or groups through social collaboration. Whether that be their love life, their homework, learning how to drive, or anything else. To them, their first impulse is that's a collective action. It's interesting when so much of scholarship has this model of some solitary exercise of the pursuit of information and knowledge, or the trains going through the room. Personalization, this mini market idea, consumers and kids will demand things to be made for me, not us, me. You don't like Amazon. You don't like eBay. You like my Amazon, my eBay. You like highly customized, individualized services that bring you value. You know, a perfect example of this, another great story, is my son, Jeff. When I was at the FCC, it was when MP3s were invented, and all of a sudden kids are downloading music on Napster. So I was curious, and I go home, go to the family computer. That was a day long ago when there was one computer in the house. And I'm like, what's this folder? Open it. 4,000 songs. I don't remember buying those. So I say to my son, Jeff, I'm kind of in the government. I'm a public official. This sort of downloading music to no end, I think, is a bad idea. So I'm going to be a good father, and I'm going to give you a little iTunes account, which had just been invented. It's a great new service. Songs are 99 cents. You're going to love it. He looks at me with just indignance dripping from his lips. That sucks. Music should be free. He storms out of the room. Wow. Thinking music companies are in more trouble than I thought. Because my little Che Guevara revolutionary has no interest in paying the man for music. And he will not be told otherwise. And I thought, this is curious. And then we get the cell phone bill. And I see that young Guevara has $40 in ringtone purchases. Now, I don't get it. To me, I thought a ringtone was like 30 seconds of really bad music. But for the full-length 99 cents, you can get the whole song, and I'm very confused. So I invite him back in the room. Now the beret's tilted to the side. Sideburns have grown in. I said, Jeff, I don't understand. You don't want to pay 99 cents for the music, but you're buying all these ringtones for like $2.99 a ringtone. It's just bad music. What gives? Don't try to understand us. Stomps out of the room. And I thought, and I said, you know what? I do understand them. Music is entertainment. Ringtones are individualization. Teens will always be teens. They want their world to belong to themselves. The ringtone represents an identity, something they highly value. But you'll see that in everything they do, a high degree of personalization and customization. And watch these kids because they're packing. They don't move without their stuff. And there's a lot of digital stuff now hanging off their pistol belts. Just to throw out some, 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds now have smartphones. 66% of young adults own laptops. 95% of teens are online. 80% own gaming devices and MP3 players, and they're taking them anywhere they want to go. Your classroom, their workplace, their social gatherings, and they expect to power them up and use them at a moment's notice. I had been away from teaching a long time. I go back into a law school classroom, and I'm blown by the nothing but screens looking at me. And God help you if you try to take them away. And then finally, their world is just so fast. You know, we LOL with our BFFs, dispense with capital letters. Apparently, the shift key is apparently an insufferable burden. Punctuation has been rejected as a pesky grammatical speed bump, better used and repurposed to express emotion, apparently. The world is moving really, really fast. A great book by James Gleick called Faster. He talks about the ever-accelerating pace of life, the way we demand instant coffee, microwave food, no commercials. One of my favorite statistics in the media space is when I was a kid, when a television show ended, there was black. Literally, the metaphor of a curtain came down. A second would go by, and a curtain would kind of come up again quite gracefully. Television companies who produce content for years have been slowly shrinking the gaps in space between content, finding that the consumer and the youth will not tolerate the delay. It started out by putting outtakes at the end of shows, if you've noticed. You got to see the outtakes. Why? Because they don't want you to change the channel. If you're given a minute of boredom, you're done. You change the channel. Now there's almost no separation between cuts in the editorial process. My kids work at this incredible speed. And they've come to believe that they are some great Darwinian superior multitasking being. Quite arrogantly so. But cognitive scientists tell us they're full of it. There is no such thing other than a mind divided among too many things simultaneously, but they think so. And I happen to be a person who believes the world's great problems will still require long periods of intense and sustained concentration. And I worry my children have less of that than the generation that went before them. It's no surprise that we continue to see ADD as the central concern among a lot of high school kids. And you know what? God help us, they're cheaters. They cheat. They grew up in cut and paste. They have a hard time understanding the idea of property or propriety. They have a hard time understanding why, if you can cut something, paste it, associate it with something else, what is wrong with that? Some studies put the number as high as 2/3 of kids admit to cheating on tests or assignments through digital technology. It is a serious problem because the tools do not allow the barriers that used to exist to those kinds of activities. And they have a culture that seems to believe in quite accepting way that they're not doing anything wrong. It's kind of the way the music industry realized kids became very acclimated that music is not theft. We can't let a generation of students take hold with the view that taking someone else's intellectual work is acceptable. So as we see these changes change communications markets, it's going to change your educational institutions, obviously. Clearly, they're going to have to become more student-centered. They will demand it, no matter what you do. They will demand to be that participant I talked about. And they can learn anytime, anywhere from anyone, and they will insist that be part of their experience at their own pace and at windows of time of their choosing. You will see us struggle more with blended education models. We will have to rethink the balance between the role of the professor at the front of the classroom and the role of the student as a lifelong individualized learner, and how to put them together in a way that they're synergistically more powerful than they are separately. A huge number of kids increasingly have taken classes, full classes online, and that will continue. Collaboration. Again, they expect to work in teams. They expect to work on problems collectively. Not all scholarship is designed that way. And the internet has essentially put the world's entire knowledge record at their fingertips. I remember spending a lot of time in college learning about primary resources, footnotes, spending hours in the library trying to find some document, some book. My kids' research consists of a Google window, period. But yet we haven't sufficiently developed systems of trust and propriety in that content. So we see greater efforts at open learning initiatives, open classrooms, open Yale. My son sits and does his calculus homework. I watch him. It's the most fascinating thing. He's doing the exercises he's been assigned. He glances at his notes, but he very quickly brings up the computer and finds YouTube videos of professors teaching concepts he doesn't understand. Or he goes to Microsoft, where has resources about formulas and their interaction with real problems. He's doing this constantly, back and forth, and we'll see that a lot more. And I think many of these changes, if we watch, are going to come from K through 12 first, because sometimes invention follows necessity. We have a failed and broken K through 12 system in which a quarter of our kids are dropping out, 50% if they're black or Hispanic, 7,000 kids a day. We're in crisis. A huge amount of government resources are focused on K through 12 reform. Charter schools are coming up with innovative hybrid models. A lot of that is what the students who will then come to higher education will have been exposed to and continue to expect. They will be leaders in that phase, and the workforce will demand it. So it's a brave new world. And I'll just leave you to paraphrase a great quote from Václav Havel, who said, "We live in a world where everything seems possible, but nothing at all is certain." And that creates a lot of anxiety. But if we do it well, our kids will be the envy of the world. Our education systems will continue their proud tradition of educating the world's great leaders, and we will rediscover the American dream for the information age. I commend you for what you're doing, and thank you for having me here today. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that you all have a lot of questions, and Michael Powell has graciously agreed to take them from the audience. Bobby Camille is going to be out there with the microphone. I think we have our...
Wow.
No power blackout, just want you to be seen. Please give your name and where you're from before you speak.
Michael Powell. I'm Brad Wheeler from Indiana University. I'm the CIO there. I know you know a lot about networks and telecommunications. One of the things that is an ongoing challenge for higher ed right now is the ongoing debate about how we're going to provide the network to colleges and universities. Many states jumped out with some public investment. They built their own fiber networks. They connected K through 12, higher ed, et cetera, and often those were done in a public-private partnership. But just like, I guess there's daffodils in March, tulips in May, state by state, we're back into the battleground. I've been on email this morning. The telcos are again trying to kill the public networks so that they can sell one-off connections to each college, to each campus, at prices and terms that generally are not favorable relative to what we can do by aggregating and doing that on our own. I also add that, as you know, with BTOP money that came out of the Obama administration and others, some states are jumping forward with very aggressive public-private partnerships. Pennsylvania, for example, $100 million new network with many of the telcos, but also public and private. We're in this year after year after year of battle. In all things digital, these networks really matter. How do we break out of this just recurring cycle of legislative battles year after year? As you know, Wisconsin, that decision went very badly up there, and they're trying to figure out how to get out from under it. The University of Wisconsin was almost in a situation that their researchers could not even connect to the national network for the egregious legislation that was shoved through up there. How do we get out of this annual cycle? Because networks matter to many of the things we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's a challenging question, and there's no quickie answer, but I'd say a couple of things. One part is political, which is there are those of us who are unabashed techno-evangelists who believe that this is not just some luxury addition or supplemental value service to the core and critical needs of the country. Broadband is not a utility. It is the tool in the toolbox that lets us solve our national problems. Healthcare is an information problem. The education system is an information problem. Doesn't matter which issue you pick, immigration, anything. There will never be a national problem without a critical component of that being a technological element. Okay, but we still have, I would argue with you, a political system that tends to treat architecture like this in the customary ways of utility services like oil, gas, and water. And we have to transform that approach and that perception, right? This is not about continued regulatory investment or regulatory regulation. This is about critical and essential tools for the solution of problems. So there's one, this philosophical, analytical, cultural transformation that has to happen, particularly in legislatures, because there's no greater frustration, if I'm going to be blunt, than walking into most Congresses or legislatures or General Assemblies and trying to have a conversation about the value of IP protocol with your average elected representative. And I like to see initiatives that hold people responsible for that. If you're running for mayor and you're going to come out and tell me about how the garbage is going to be collected, and you promise to fix roads, and you promise to fix up the buildings of school, I want to know what you promise to do to make sure my children have access to 21st century information architecture. This rarely is a component of a traditional political campaign. Secondly, just real quickly, I'm most believing in the idea that these have to be partnerships for a couple of reasons. One, I find state governments to be unreliable partners from a funding and durability basis. I ran the board of a major public institution for many years, one that is the second oldest college in the United States, a jewel to the state of Virginia, one that has educated the likes of Thomas Jefferson, and the state of Virginia provides 16% of our operating budget. This is before we even have a conversation about technology. And I just don't have confidence in either the legislative process, the political process, to provide the kind of consistency needed. So you have to bring in partnerships that have models that have greater incentives for that investment in longer term. That's easier said than done, but that's why. And then the other thing I find is that even when you get some great network built, often by a purely public institution, it's hard to keep it innovating at the rate that technology demands. So for example, in America, we wired every classroom in the country with broadband. But if we did it today, we would have done it wirelessly. But we're stuck with what we did. We don't have a great model for another $2.25 billion, per year to do it again. And so you have to launch onto something that has an innovation cycle that keeps up with Moore's law. So, private sector is motivated by those incentives. So that's part of the answer. But we also have to change the way the public government thinks about it.
Christopher Nickerson from Nevada State College. You mentioned the my generation or I generation, and there's also this confluence of standardization. So how are those two, which are diametrically opposed, going to really converge, or which way do you see it kind of going?
So I still think it's personalization, because I think what gets standardized is the methods and approaches to customization. Meaning, Windows, for example, just to use an example, Windows 8 might be a standard platform, but it comes with infinite variability. Your desktop doesn't look like mine. Your mouse, your cursor doesn't look like mine. The way you've organized your folders doesn't look like mine. Increasingly, right, you get the standardization to get scale, but you operate at your peril if your standardized solution doesn't make room for high degrees of individualization and customization. So I don't think that very many people who've tried to force a one-size-fits-all or closed system, and we could talk for hours about Apple, the argument that they are closed, but I would argue that they close in a very creative way that allows consumers to still have these benefits. So I think they go together. Standardization brings efficiency and scale, but we shouldn't confuse that with it better incorporate the variables that allow a high degree of specialization for the individual user.
Anybody else have a question? Open mic. 1 second.
Good morning. I'm Denise Spiro. I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm actually at a early childhood school through 8th grade, and we're in a lot of technology, and I'm kind of like you, stuck back in, we want our children to advance, but I still think we should teach them cursive handwriting stage and about the ADHD and everything. So where is the balance? We want to prepare our students. All of our students have notebook laptop computers in 5th through 8th grade. Where do you draw the line in teaching them, okay, you have to focus. You have to sit down. You have to have the conversation. It's not just me.
Yeah, and we could write a whole book here. I'll tell you what I would issue as a challenge for all of us, which I've begun to do both in my personal life, my life at work. Some of my staff's here, they will tell you this. And even with the raising of my children at home, who are now much older, so they don't listen to me anyway. But we have to understand that all this stuff I talk about, digitalization versus analog, is not some evolutionary substitution as if all things digital are now superior and all things analog are inferior. That's a terrible mistake. So for example, beauty is analog. A leaf waving in the wind on a tree is an analog function. That's an elegance that a binary system doesn't generally produce. The human computer can say the word yes over 130 distinct ways. And I can convey meaning to you in 130 distinct ways with one word. To a computer, yes is only one thing. It's on or off. That creates a sort of rigidity in computing systems that isn't replicated by human intuition, wisdom, repose, reflection, insight, daydreaming. I mean, everything that we should remember is that 3,000 years of evolution has produced a computer that's head and shoulders above anything that's going on in the electronic space, and that's this. And I think that that has to be nurtured more consciously and more openly than we have. If I were raising my kids again, I would say on Sunday morning, our family sits down and reads for an hour, period, and everything goes off. I would never tolerate my children pulling out their phones at dinner. I would force them to have conversations with people in long form, right? That's not, yeah, sure, I guess. You know, I would make them spend more time with their grandparents who won't tolerate that. I mean, I have a whole lot of things I'd do over. But I think that we have to see it. You know, if you read the Steve Jobs biography, which I really would commend to you, his genius was that he understood that you had to be an artist and a technologist. You know, you had to be a liberal artist as well as a scientist. And I hope we don't lose that, because I'm far from persuaded. So I have lawyers who work for me, and I say, you can't email me a legal memo. I insist it be in writing. I think you do something cognitively different when you produce paper than when you produce electronic emails. And I've seen the difference in good work and bad work. I had a judge who once showed me this article, kids get married to their work too fast because it looks so good. And when I was in college, you wrote a paper, I still had to pull out legal pads and write for hours and days, and I got to hire someone to type it. It was a very laborious editorial process. My kid writes a paragraph, he thinks it's Chaucer. I mean, the spelling's checked, it's formatted right, it looks really good. And what we find in research is they get wedded to the work at a stage where it's nothing but rough draft. At my age, at that time, I would have seen nothing but handwritten scribble on a legal pad. He sees something he thinks is finished. And forcing the editorial process to go on 5 and 6 and 7 rounds is hard with this group for that reason.
I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
You said you would not let your kids bring their phones to the table. What do you do when it's your husband?
You need to get him under control.
I rest my case.
That would take a whole separate summit.
Let me suggest before we end that when we break, people in the back who are standing, you need to find seats, and it's a good thing to come up here and look around as you do it.
Why don't we see if there's one last question?
Hi, good morning. I'm Casey Green with the Campus Computing Project. Your response to Brad Wheeler talked about a lot of these issues as being a political process in terms of the conversations in state legislatures, higher ed's concern for net neutrality, which also plays out in the consumer market. There's some really interesting data, for example, about the Siri users on iPhones consume a huge proportion of broadband, other kinds of issues. I think there's a sense for many of us who work in higher ed that we do a pretty crappy job of our conversations with state legislatures and in Washington. You've been in the FCC, you represent NCTA, largest broadband provider in the cable industry. What does higher ed need to do better in these conversations? Admittedly, we don't have the armies of lobbyists that represent other industries that occasionally we clash with on issues of compelling public policy. Give us 3 bullet points about how to make these the presentation, the statement, more compelling in state legislatures and in Washington.
It's a great question. I can only reflect a little bit about the exact same way that question was presented to me at William & Mary when we were struggling with the same problem. And in the course of just funding, right? And I think it's the same whether it's technology or funding. We realized that that's not our, one, know what you don't do and what you do, right? What we realized is, A, we don't just send the administration to see General Assembly. We found more and more ways to have our students and our students' achievements be more front and center in our conversation with political life. People are always moved to see a young sophomore who's pursuing independent research in chemistry and just published. And we realized without selling them, they are the product. And the institutional complex of the president and the faculty, and we also had to learn how to employ faculty more who have a natural, allergic aversion to having anything to do with it, as if it taints the academy or the scholarship. But to continue to have them have the resources they need to pursue critical and important work, both individually as scholars and with students, meant that we had to get them in the conversation more too. So when we had a professor doing just really something significant and important, we would try to hold events or take that professor and hold an event in Washington, a cocktail reception, which he would do a thing on his book. So one, expanding and using the valuable parts of what we do. The other thing is the school realized it had to team up with the state's leading business leaders who have a passion for education and see it in economic terms for the state. So whether we called ours, I think, Business 21 or something like that, where we worked with other universities in the state of Virginia to build prominent citizen business coalitions who committed themselves, their resources, and their companies to pounding on the legislature about the quality and jewel of having a strong higher education environment in the state of Virginia for the future of Virginia's economic health, its employment, and its services. And they have those relationships, they have the money, and they have the credibility of being instrumental to the economic well-being of the state in a way that it was hard for the university to do solo. So I don't know if that's 3 talking points, but I think it's not traditional lobbying. I mean, I always view that lobbying is only good if you're selling what you believe in. But you really have to put out front and center the things that make the work worthy and a calling, and not just a supplicant, another supplicant at the table. And the other thing is we always found that you had to have strong kind of presidential leadership and stuff that gave the academy the freedom to have controversial ideas and not let them become critical political excuses for not funding, which happens sometimes as well. So it's not easy, but I've seen it work. We certainly gained an improvement, and we figured out we were underutilizing alumni in that as well. And so we consider our entire alumni universe an army of lobbyists if deployed correctly. Thank you.
In thanking Michael Powell.
Thank you.